The restaurant empire collapsed on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Helena Brennan was standing in a castle kitchen beneath the city, staring at instructions written in calligraphy that might have been 3 centuries old. You understand what we're asking? The woman who'd hired her wore a dove-gray suit that probably cost more than Helena's car had back when she'd owned a car. Her skin was the color of fresh snow, her hair a cascade of white silk, and her eyes held the particular stillness of someone who'd stopped blinking out of habit rather than necessity. You want me to cook dinner for people who don't eat? Helena set the parchment down on the marble counter. The kitchen was vast, modernized but retaining its medieval bones, vaulted ceilings, stone walls, copper pots hanging in descending sizes like a musical scale. The Table of Remembrance. It's been dormant for 40 years. 43, the woman corrected. The woman. The last chef retired. We never replaced her, but His Majesty has decided the tradition should be revived. She paused, studying Helena with an intensity that made her want to check if her shirt was buttoned correctly. Your references were impeccable. Your former sous chef spoke very highly of you. Former. Everything was former now. Former chef de cuisine. Former co-owner. Former half of a partnership that had made her name synonymous with brilliance, right before it made her name disappear entirely. When do I start? Tonight. The court gathers at moonrise. Helena had 2 hours to review the menus, assess the pantry, and prepare 8 courses for a table of 17. Under normal circumstances, it would have been impossible. These weren't normal circumstances. The pantry was stocked with ingredients she'd only dreamed of: white truffles the size of tennis balls, saffron in jars rather than threads, olive oil that probably cost more per ounce than gold. And the menu, once she deciphered the archaic language, was straightforward. They didn't want molecular gastronomy or deconstructed classics. They wanted the food of memory: roasted meat, fresh bread, fruit tarts, things that tasted like being human. She cooked the way she used to, before every plate became a negotiation, before Marcus had started telling her that her instincts were too rustic, too simple, not elevated enough for the brand they were building. She roasted a leg of lamb with rosemary and garlic until the skin crisped and the fat ran clear. She baked bread that filled the kitchen with yeast and warmth. She made a soup with summer vegetables that tasted like sunshine, and a chocolate torte so dark it was almost savagery. At moonrise, she carried the first course up a spiral staircase into a dining room that belonged in a museum. The table was black walnut, polished to a mirror shine. Candelabras held actual candles, dozens of them, casting golden light over faces that were uniformly pale and beautiful and utterly inhuman. They watched her set down the soup course with expressions ranging from curiosity to something that might have been hunger, though not for food. At the head of the table sat a man who could only be the king. He was taller than the others, even seated, with hair that fell past his shoulders in a sheet of pure white. His face was angular, severe, the kind of bone structure that would have made ancient sculptors weep. He wore black, simple and unadorned, and he held himself with the particular stillness of absolute power. When his eyes met hers gray, the color of winter storms, Helena felt the impact like a physical thing. Your Majesty. She inclined her head, the way the woman in gray had instructed. Summer vegetable soup with basil oil. He looked at the bowl, then back at her. You made this? Yes. Tell me about it. She blinked. The soup? Everything you put into it. Everything you did. So she did. She told him about the tomatoes, how she'd chosen them for sweetness and acidity, about blanching and shocking them to keep the color bright. She told him about the stock, simmered for hours with vegetable scraps and herbs, about the basil oil she'd made by blanching basil leaves and blending them with olive oil and a pinch of salt, straining it through cheesecloth until it was emerald bright. He listened to every word, his gaze never leaving her face, and when she finished, he said, "Thank you." She served 17 bowls. No one lifted a spoon. They sat there, looking at the food, and Helena realized they were remembering. Whatever this ritual was, it wasn't about eating. It was about being near food, about the smell and the sight of it, about calling up memories of what it had been to need sustenance, to taste, to be mortal. She brought out the next course, and the next, lamb with roasted potatoes, salad with pears and walnuts. Each time, she described what she'd made and how she'd made it, and they listened like she was telling them stories about a country they'd once visited and could never return to. By the time she served dessert, the chocolate torte with raspberry coulis, it was past midnight and she was exhausted in a way that felt clean. Good. She'd cooked for hours, and it had mattered, even if no one had taken a single bite. She was clearing the plates when the king spoke again. "What is your name?" "Helena Brennan, Your Majesty." "Helena." He said it slowly, like he was tasting it. "You will return tomorrow." It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." She returned the next night, and the night after that. The Table of Remembrance became her routine, her purpose, the thing that got her out of the narrow apartment she'd moved into after Marcus kept the house, the cars, the restaurant, and the life they'd built together. Every evening she descended into the castle kitchen and cooked food that would never be eaten, and every evening she carried it up to a table of vampires who watched her like she was performing magic. The king, she learned his name, was Lucian Alaric. Though no one addressed him as anything but Your Majesty, began to ask her more questions. Not just about the food, but about her. Where she'd trained, why she'd become a chef, what her favorite meal was. "Pasta," she said one night, while serving a risotto she'd stirred for 40 minutes until it was perfectly creamy. "Simple pasta with garlic, olive oil, and chili flakes. My grandmother made it when I was a child." "You miss her?" "Every day." He nodded, and she had the strangest sense that he understood exactly what she meant, that he carried his own catalog of people he'd lost, so many that they must blur together like pages in a book read too many times. The court began to warm to her as well. The woman in gray, her name was Celine, and she was the king's advisor, started staying after the meals to talk about the history of the table. It had been a tradition for nearly 1,000 years, a way for the eldest vampires to hold on to their humanity, to remember that they'd once been something other than predators. "But it requires a certain kind of cook," Celine explained, sipping wine that Helena suspected wasn't wine at all. "Someone who understands that food is memory. You don't just follow recipes, you cook with intention." Helena thought about Marcus, who'd treated recipes like mathematical formulas, precise and cold, who'd told her that her emotional approach to cooking was a weakness, something to be trained out of her. "I cook the way I was taught," she said. "With love." Celine smiled, showing just a hint of fang. "We know." It was 3 weeks into her tenure when Lucian asked her to stay after the court had dispersed. "There is something you should understand about the Table of Remembrance," he said, leading her out onto a balcony that overlooked the city. Lights glittered below them, a constellation of human life going on without any idea that immortals walked among them. "The ritual has a second purpose." Helena waited. "When we drink from someone who has recently eaten, we taste what they tasted. For a few moments we experience food again, not the memory of it, but the reality. Texture, flavor, warmth." He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "That is why the table matters. The chef would eat from the meal they'd prepared, and then one of us would feed, and we could taste their work." Helena's mouth went dry. "You want to drink from me? I am asking your permission. You would be well compensated, and you would never be harmed. It would happen once per week, after you've eaten whatever you wished from the meal you've prepared." He paused. "You may refuse. Your employment does not depend on your consent." She should have been terrified. Every instinct should have been screaming at her to run, but instead, she found herself curious. Would it hurt? No, I would be very careful. She believed him. She didn't know why, but she did. "Once a week," she said, "and I choose what I eat." "Of course." The first time happened 4 days later. She'd prepared a feast beef bourguignon, creamy mashed potatoes, roasted carrots glazed with honey, a green salad, fresh rolls, and a lemon tart that was so tart it made her eyes water. When the court had left and the kitchen was clean, Lucian returned. "Eat," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. So she sat at the counter and ate. She served herself modest portions of everything, tasting each dish the way she'd been trained to, evaluating flavor and texture and balance. The beef was tender, falling apart at the touch of a fork. The potatoes were silky. The tart was perfect, bright and sweet and sharp all at once. Lucian watched her eat the way other people watch sunsets. When she'd finished, she set down her fork and turned to him. Now. He moved closer, and she tilted her head to the side, baring her throat the way she'd seen in movies. But he shook his head. Your wrist is easier for a first time. She held out her hand, and he took it with a gentleness that surprised her. His skin was cool, smooth, and his thumb brushed over her pulse point like he was reading something written there. This will feel strange, but not painful, he said, and then he bit down. There was a brief sting, sharp and bright, and then something else, a pull, a warmth spreading up her arm, a sensation that was intimate in a way she hadn't expected. She could feel him drinking, feel the rhythm of it, and behind her closed eyelids, she saw colors blooming. When he lifted his head, his eyes had darkened to charcoal, and there was color in his cheeks, just the faintest hint of warmth beneath that marble skin. The beef, he said, his voice rough. I tasted the wine in it, the thyme, and the carrots the honey caramelized at the edges, and the lemon, God, the lemon. Helena realized she was shaking. Did it work? It was extraordinary. He was still holding her wrist, and he lifted it now, pressing his mouth to the small wound he'd made. She felt a tingle, and when he pulled away, the bite marks were gone, healed to smooth skin. Thank you. She should have been frightened. She'd just been bitten by a vampire king, but instead she felt useful, seen, like she'd given him something that mattered. Same time next week? She asked, and he smiled, a real smile that transformed his severe face into something almost boyish. Same time next week. It became their routine. She would cook, the court would remember, and afterward, she would eat, and Lucian would taste the meal through her blood. He was always careful, always respectful, and over time, the feeding became less strange and more comfortable. She started to prepare meals specifically for those moments, choosing dishes that would translate well through blood, flavors that were bold and clear. And they talked. After the feeding, they would sit in the kitchen or on the balcony, and they would talk about everything. He told her about being turned 600 years ago, about watching the world change, about the loneliness of immortality. She told him about growing up in a restaurant family, about the magic of cooking, about Marcus. He was my sous chef, she explained one night, 2 months into her employment. We worked together for 3 years before we started dating, another 2 before we opened our own place. Ember, that was the name. We built it together, from the ground up. I designed the menu. He managed the front of house. It was perfect. What happened? He started telling people he was the chef, not co-chef, not executive chef, the chef. Food critics would come, and they'd ask to meet the chef. And Marcus would go out, and he'd talk about the vision and the inspiration, and he'd take credit for dishes I'd created. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I thought it didn't matter, we were partners. But then the awards started coming. Best New Chef, Rising Star, all with his name. And when I tried to talk to him about it, he said I was being selfish, that the restaurant needed a face and he was better at publicity. So you let him. I loved him. And I thought he loved me. She laughed, but it came out bitter. 2 months ago, he told me he wanted to open a second location, that it was time to expand the brand, his brand, and when I said I wanted my name on it too, as co-owner, as co-chef, he told me I was replaceable, that any competent cook could execute my recipes. He bought out my share of Ember for a fraction of what it was worth, and I signed the papers because I was too tired to fight. Lucian was quiet for a long moment. He stole your work. He did. And your name. That too. You should have fought him. Maybe, but I didn't have anything left to fight with. She looked at him, at the anger simmering in his storm-gray eyes. Why does it matter to you? Because you are brilliant, he said simply, and he made you believe you weren't. Something cracked open in her chest, something that had been sealed tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Thank you, she whispered. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His skin was cool, but the gesture was warm. "You are brilliant, Helena, and you are not replaceable. Remember that." She did. The weeks bled into months. Helena fell into the rhythm of the castle, of the court, of Lucian. She started to think of him not as the king, but as Lucian, the man who listened to her stories and told her his own, who closed his eyes when he tasted her blood and looked like he was experiencing grace. The court noticed. Of course they noticed. Vampires were nothing if not observant, and the way Lucian looked at her, the way he lingered after feedings, the way he found excuses to be in the kitchen while she cooked was impossible to miss. "The king favors you," Celine said one evening, helping Helena chop vegetables. "The court is talking." "What are they saying?" "That he hasn't shown interest in anyone in decades, that you've woken something in him." She paused, her knife stilling. "That he is becoming dependent on you." "Dependent?" "The crown has a mouth it depends on," Celine quoted. "That's what they're whispering. You feed him in a way no one else can. It makes you powerful, Helena, and power makes you a target." "I'm just a cook." "You are far more than that, and you know it." Helena did know it, because somewhere between the first meal and the 50th, between the first feeding and the 20th, she'd fallen in love with a vampire king. It was absurd, impossible. She was human, mortal, fragile. He was ancient, powerful, eternal. But when he looked at her, she felt like she mattered, like she was more than the person Marcus had tried to reduce her to, and she hoped that he might feel the same way. She was preparing a menu for a winter feast when the phone call came. "Helena Brennan?" The voice was unfamiliar, crisp, and professional. "This is Jonathan Cade from Cade & Associates. We represent Marcus Sterling. We're calling to inform you that our client is filing a lawsuit regarding intellectual property theft." Helena nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "Mr. Sterling alleges that you have stolen proprietary recipes from Ember and are using them in your current employment. We're demanding that you cease and desist immediately, and we're seeking damages for loss of revenue and reputational harm." "That's insane. Those recipes are mine. I created them." "Mr. Sterling has documentation proving that all recipes created during your partnership belong jointly to the restaurant. As he is now the sole owner, they belong to him." A pause. "We'll be sending a formal demand letter. Please retain counsel." The line went dead. Helena stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, and felt the world tilt. Marcus was suing her, for recipes she'd written, for work she'd done. "Helena?" Lucian's voice came from the doorway. "What's wrong?" She told him. Everything, the lawsuit, the allegations, the threat. And as she spoke, she saw his expression shift from concern to something darker. "He dares to claim your work as his own, again. He has paperwork, a partnership agreement. Everything we created while we were together is legally joint property. And he owns the restaurant now, so he owns nothing. You created those recipes. Your mind, your skill, your inspiration. The law doesn't care about inspiration. Then the law is wrong." He moved closer, and there was something dangerous in his eyes, something that reminded her that he wasn't just a man she'd fallen for. He was a king, an apex predator, someone who had survived 6 centuries by being smarter and stronger and more ruthless than anyone who challenged him. "Let him file his lawsuit. We will bury him in the truth." Lucian. "Do you have proof? Notebooks, drafts, anything that shows the recipes originated with you?" She thought of the battered notebook she'd kept since culinary school, filled with scribbled ideas and crossed-out ingredients and sketches of plating. She'd brought it with her when she'd left Ember, tucked into a box of personal belongings Marcus hadn't wanted. "I have my notebook, 10 years of recipes and notes, but I don't know if that's enough." "It will be. I will make certain of it." He cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head up so she had to meet his eyes. "You are not fighting him alone this time. Do you understand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Now cook. Show him that you have not stopped creating, that you never needed him to be extraordinary." So she cooked. She poured everything into the meal, anger and hurt and defiance and love. She made a standing rib roast with horseradish cream. She made Duchess potatoes, each one piped and browned to perfection. She made a salad with winter citrus and pomegranate seeds that looked like rubies. She made a chocolate souffle that rose tall and proud, a feat of engineering and faith. And when the court had gathered and she'd served every course, she ate. She ate with intention, tasting every flavor, committing every bite to memory, and when Lucian fed from her that night, she felt his wonder through the connection between them. "Magnificent," he breathed. "Helena, you are magnificent. Tell that to Marcus's lawyer." "I will tell it to Marcus himself if necessary." She laughed despite everything. "You can't just threaten my ex-boyfriend, Your Majesty. I can do anything I wish. I am the king." But his eyes were warm, and his hand was gentle as he healed the bite on her wrist. "Trust me." She did. The lawsuit moved forward. Marcus's lawyer sent demand letters. Helena retained a lawyer of her own, a severe woman named Patricia, who came highly recommended by Celine, and who did not seem remotely surprised to learn her client worked for vampires. "We'll need to prove authorship," Patricia explained, spreading documents across the castle's library table. "Your notebook is an excellent start, but we need more. Witnesses who can testify that you created the recipes, documentation showing dates, anything that proves you were the creative force behind Ember's menu." Helena contacted her former sous chef, a brilliant young woman named Tessa, who'd left Ember 6 months after Helena had, disgusted by Marcus's ego. Tessa agreed to testify, and she brought others, line cooks and prep cooks and servers who'd all watched Helena build the menu from scratch. But Marcus had something they didn't expect. "He's claiming that you're using the recipes at your current place of employment," Patricia said, her voice tight. "And he's demanding to know where you work, what you're cooking, and for whom. He's arguing that if you're still using his recipes, it proves they were never yours. They were always mine." "I know. But he's being clever. He's making this about your current work, not your past work. And if he can prove you're profiting from the recipes, I'm not profiting. The Table of Remembrance is a private ritual. I'm cooking for a closed court." He doesn't know that. And his lawyer is digging. If they find out you're working for the vampire court. Patricia trailed off. "The treaty between vampires and humans is delicate. Publicizing your employment could cause significant political ramifications." Helena felt cold. She hadn't thought about that. The vampire court existed in secret, a shadow government that most humans didn't know about. If Marcus exposed them, if he made her job public, it could shatter the carefully maintained balance between the two worlds. "He wouldn't," she said. "He wouldn't risk that just to win a lawsuit." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Marcus would risk anything if he thought it would benefit him. And she was right. The story broke on a Thursday. Some gossip blog picked it up first, a blind item about a celebrity chef working for a mysterious employer, cooking food that was never eaten. By Friday, it had spread to legitimate news outlets. By Saturday, Marcus was giving interviews. "I'm concerned about Helena," he said, standing outside Ember with the expression of performative worry. "She's clearly in a vulnerable place, and I worry she's being exploited. Cooking for people who don't eat? It sounds like she's involved with some kind of cult. I just want to make sure she's safe." Helena watched the interview on a laptop in the castle kitchen and felt rage boil through her. "He's positioning himself as the concerned ex," Celine said, standing behind her. "Clever. Manipulative, but clever. He's trying to make me look crazy. He's trying to discredit you. If you appear unstable, it will be easier for him to argue that your claim to the recipes is delusional. But I have proof. I have my notebook. I have witnesses. And he has the court of public opinion." Celine's voice was grim. "Helena, this is going to get worse before it gets better." She was right. Marcus's lawyer filed a motion demanding that Helena disclose her employer's identity. Patricia fought it, but the judge seemed sympathetic to the argument that Marcus had a right to know if his intellectual property was being used for profit. "We need to give them something," Patricia said. "If we refuse to disclose, it makes you look like you're hiding something illegal. I am hiding something, the entire vampire court. Then we need another strategy." The strategy came from an unexpected source. Lucian called a meeting of the court, and Helena was invited to attend. She walked into the great hall, a room she'd only glimpsed before, all vaulted ceilings and stained glass and ancient tapestries, and found herself facing 17 of the most powerful vampires in the city. "Helena Brennan stands accused of theft," Lucian said, his voice ringing through the hall. "Her former partner claims ownership of her work, and in his pursuit of this claim, he has exposed our court to public scrutiny. This is not merely a human legal matter, it is an attack on our secrecy, and therefore an attack on all of us." There was a murmur of agreement. "What do you propose, Your Majesty?" asked a vampire with silver hair and eyes like ice. "I propose we end this. Publicly. Decisively." Lucian looked at Helena. "With your permission." "Permission for what?" "To reveal my identity as your employer. To make it clear that you work for me and that I will not tolerate false claims against you." Helena's heart stuttered. "Lucian, you can't if people know you're real, if they know the court exists. They already suspect. Your former partner has made certain of that. The only question now is whether we control the narrative or let him control it." He descended the steps from his throne, crossing the distance between them until he stood directly in front of her. "I will not let him destroy you to save himself, and I will not hide while he claims credit for your brilliance." "The treaty." "I wrote the treaty," Lucian said quietly. 200 years ago, when humans and vampires first agreed to coexist in secrecy, I can amend it if necessary. But I do not believe it will be necessary. We are not exposing ourselves as predators. We are exposing ourselves as patrons of the arts, as a court that values culture and memory and tradition. Let the humans see that we are more than the monsters they imagine. Celine stepped forward. "It's a risk, Your Majesty. Everything worth doing is a risk." He turned back to Helena. "But the choice is yours. I will not force you into the spotlight if you do not wish it." Helena thought about Marcus, about the way he'd taken credit for her work, about the years she'd spent in his shadow. She thought about the Table of Remembrance, about the vampires who gathered each night to remember their humanity. She thought about Lucian, who'd given her back her voice, who'd reminded her that she was more than what Marcus had reduced her to. "Do it," she said. "Let's end this." The press conference was held 3 days later in the Great Hall, open to the public for the first time in a century. News crews set up cameras. Journalists crowded into the space, their faces a mix of skepticism and fascination. And Lucian stood at the front of the room, regal and terrifying and utterly composed, and told them the truth. "My name is Lucian Alaric. I am the king of the vampire court of this city, a position I have held for 600 years. Helena Brennan is employed by me to prepare meals for the Table of Remembrance, a tradition that honors our lost mortality. The recipes she uses are her own creation, developed over a decade of work, and any claim to the contrary is a lie." The room erupted. Questions shouted from every direction, cameras flashing. But Lucian raised one hand, and the room fell silent. "I will take questions, but first, Helena will speak." He stepped aside, and Helena moved to the microphone, her heart hammering. She'd faced hostile restaurant critics and demanding customers, but this was different. This was her entire reputation, her entire future. "I created the menu for Ember," she said, her voice shaking at first, then growing stronger. "Every dish, every recipe, every flavor profile. I have notebooks dating back 10 years that prove this. I have witnesses who worked with me, who watched me develop and test and refine those recipes. Marcus Sterling managed the restaurant, but he did not create its food. And when I left, he used my work to build an empire with my name erased from it. I am not asking for credit for his success. I am asking him to stop claiming credit for my work." She stepped back, and the journalists erupted again, but this time Marcus was in the room. He'd pushed his way to the front, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. Helena and I were partners. Everything we created was joint. You were never her partner," Lucian said, and his voice was so cold, so utterly devoid of emotion, that the room went silent again. "You were her employee, and then her exploiter. You took credit for her brilliance, because you had none of your own. And who are you to judge? You're not even human. You're a monster, a leech, and you've clearly manipulated Helena into working for you. God knows what you've done to her." "I have treated her with respect," Lucian said, and there was danger in his voice now. the kind of danger that made the humans in the room step back instinctively. I have valued her skill, compensated her fairly, and ensured that her work is appreciated. You, on the other hand, have stolen from her, diminished her, and attempted to destroy her credibility when she dared to move on. You are a thief and a coward, and I will not allow you to continue this charade. Marcus's face twisted. You were nothing without me, he spat, looking at Helena. A line cook with delusions of grandeur. I made you. I gave you a platform, a name, a career. Everything you have, you owe to me. The words hit like a slap. Helena felt the old doubts rising, the voice in her head that said maybe he was right, maybe she had been nothing without him. And then Lucian spoke. She is my everything. 4 words, quiet, matter of fact, delivered without theatrics or drama, but they landed with the weight of absolute truth. Helena Brennan is the most talented chef I have encountered in 6 centuries, Lucian continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus. She creates art from simple ingredients. She brings memory to life. She feeds not just the body, but the soul. She is extraordinary, and you were privileged to work beside her, though you were too small-minded to recognize it. Helena couldn't breathe. The room had gone utterly silent, every eye on Lucian, on her, on the space between them. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around the room, at the journalists who were watching him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, and something in him seemed to crumble. This is insane, he muttered. She's brainwashed you all. Actually, said a voice from the back of the room, she hasn't. Tessa pushed through the crowd, followed by 6 other Ember employees. We worked with Helena for years. We watched her create every single recipe Marcus is claiming as his own, and we're prepared to testify to that under oath. Another voice joined in, one of the kitchen suppliers. I have invoices showing that Helena was the one ordering specialty ingredients, testing new vendors, making decisions about the menu. Marcus never involved himself in the actual cooking. And then a food critic who'd reviewed Ember in its first year. I interviewed Helena about the menu. She walked me through every dish, explained the inspiration, the technique. Marcus was barely mentioned in my notes. One by one, people stepped forward with evidence, emails, invoices, photographs of Helena in the kitchen covered in flour, grinning at the camera. A decade of proof that she had been the creative force behind Ember, that Marcus had been nothing but a competent manager riding her coattails. And Marcus, faced with the weight of testimony and documentation and truth, did what cornered men do. He tried to double down. Fine, he said, his voice rising. Maybe Helena created the recipes, but I made them famous. I'm the one who courted critics, who handled investors, who turned a neighborhood bistro into a destination. And if she's so talented, why is she working for vampires? Why is she cooking food no one eats? What kind of success is that? The kind that matters to her, Lucian said. But I think you've said enough. I haven't. You have. And there was something in Lucian's eyes now, something ancient and deadly. You came here to destroy Helena's reputation. Instead, you have revealed your own character. You have admitted to exploiting her work. You have publicly diminished her talent, and you have exposed yourself as a man who cannot succeed without stealing from those around him. I would advise you to withdraw your lawsuit and hope that Helena does not file one of her own. Marcus looked around the room, at the hostile faces, at the cameras still recording every word, and Helena saw the moment he realized he'd lost. This isn't over, he said, but his voice was weak, and everyone knew it was a lie. It is, Helena said, speaking for the first time since Lucian had called her his everything. We're done, Marcus. We've been done for a long time. I just needed to realize it. He left, slunk out of the room with his lawyer trailing behind him, and the journalists erupted into questions, but Helena couldn't hear them. She was looking at Lucian, at the vampire king who'd just stood in front of the world and declared that she mattered. Thank you, she said, when the crowd had finally thinned and they were alone in the great hall. I only spoke the truth. You said I was your everything. You are. He said it simply, like it was obvious, like it was fact. Helena, you have brought light into a life that has been dark for 600 years. You have reminded me what it means to feel, to anticipate, to want something beyond mere existence. When I taste the food you create through your blood, I am not just tasting meals, I am tasting your joy, your passion, your art. You have given me back a piece of my humanity. How could you be anything less than everything to me? She felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. I thought I was broken. After Marcus, I thought maybe I was too much, too emotional, too impractical. That my way of cooking, my way of being, was wrong. You are not wrong. You are perfect. He reached out and caught one of her tears on his finger, studying it like it was precious. And I am yours, if you want me. I know the obstacles. I know that I am not human, that I cannot give you a normal life, that I can offer you nothing but complications. But if you want me, I am yours. She thought about what she was choosing. A vampire, an immortal, a man who would never age while she grew old, who would outlive her by centuries, who existed in a world of shadows and secrets. And then she thought about the way he looked at her when she cooked, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he defended her without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. I want you, she said. I want this. Whatever complications come, I want you. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like kissing Marcus had been. Marcus had kissed like he was claiming something, like he was proving a point. Lucian kissed like he was worshipping, like she was rare and precious and worthy of reverence. His mouth was cool, his hands gentle on her face, and when they broke apart, Helena felt like she'd been remade. What happens now? She asked. Now we live, Lucian said. You cook, I rule. We find a way to make this work. It should have been impossible. A human and a vampire, a chef and a king. But they made it work. Marcus withdrew his lawsuit 2 days after the press conference, issuing a statement that claimed he'd been misled by poor counsel and wished Helena nothing but success. Patricia ensured that he signed away any claim to her recipes, past or future, and that he paid her legal fees. Ember's business declined sharply in the following months. Turns out that customers didn't enjoy eating at a restaurant where the chef had publicly admitted to stealing someone else's work. Marcus sold it a year later at a significant loss. Helena stayed at the castle, cooking for the Table of Remembrance, but she also began teaching. Celine suggested it a program to train mortal chefs in the art of cooking for vampires, of creating meals that could be tasted through blood. It wasn't just about technique, it was about intention, about emotion, about pouring yourself into the food. And once a week she ate, and Lucian fed, and they shared those moments of taste and sensation and intimacy. They fell deeper in love. It was gradual, gentle, a slow accumulation of moments that added up to certainty. Lucian began spending more time in the kitchen, watching her work, asking questions. Helena began attending court functions, learning the politics of vampire society, becoming not just the king's chef but his partner. 6 months after the press conference, Lucian came to her with a question. Do you ever think about the future? They were on the balcony, overlooking the city, and Helena was eating a slice of the apple pie she'd made for that night's table. All the time, she said. Why? Because I am immortal, and you are not, and I find myself unwilling to imagine eternity without you. Her heart stuttered. Lucian, I am not asking for an answer now, but I want you to think about it. If you wished it, I could turn you. You would become like me, immortal, unchanging, bound to the night. You would lose the sunlight. You would lose the ability to taste food. He paused, his expression pained. You would lose everything that makes you mortal. Helena set down her fork. She'd thought about this, of course. It was impossible not to think about it, loving a vampire. But hearing him say it out loud made it real. Could I still cook? Yes. But you could never taste what you created. You would have to rely on others to tell you if a dish was successful. That's... She trailed off, trying to imagine it. A lifetime, multiple lifetimes of cooking, without ever tasting her work. It should have been horrifying, and part of her recoiled from the idea. But another part of her thought about forever. About having time to perfect techniques she'd only dreamed of. About teaching generations of chefs. About never leaving Lucian. never having to face the inevitable end of their time together. "I need time to think about it," she said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I have loved you for months, Helena, and I will love you for centuries if you let me. But I will love you as a mortal or as a vampire, whatever you choose." She kissed him, tasting apple and cinnamon on her own lips, and thought about what she was willing to sacrifice for love. She thought about it for weeks. She talked to Celine, who'd been turned 300 years ago, and said it was the best decision she'd ever made. She talked to other members of the court, asked them what they missed about mortality. "Food," one of them said. "I dream about food sometimes. The taste of strawberries in summer, fresh bread with butter." "Sunlight," said another. "I miss walking in the sun without fear." "Growing old with the person I loved," said a third. "I was turned at 25, and my husband stayed mortal. I watched him age, watched him die, and I looked the same as I had on our wedding day. That was harder than anything." But they also told her about the joys, the endless time to master skills, the accumulation of knowledge, the perspective that came from watching empires rise and fall, the deep bonds formed with others who'd lived just as long. Helena listened to all of it, and then she went into the kitchen and cooked. She made every dish that had ever mattered to her. Her grandmother's pasta, the risotto she'd served on her first night at the table, the chocolate torte that had made Lucian smile. She cooked for 3 days straight, tasting everything, making notes, committing the flavors to memory. And on the third night, she went to Lucian. "I've decided," she said. He went very still. "Tell me." "I want to be turned, but not yet." She held up a hand when he started to speak. "I want 1 more year as a human. I want to taste everything I can, to experience every meal, every flavor, every sensation. And then, on the anniversary of the day we met, I want you to turn me." "Helena, you've had 600 years to remember your mortal life, Lucian. I've had 28. Give me 1 more. Let me build memories that I can carry into eternity. And then I'll be yours, truly and completely, for as long as forever lasts." He cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes intense. "You're certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything." "Then we have 1 year," he said. "Let's make it count." They did. Helena cooked her way through the seasons. In spring, she made dishes with fresh vegetables and herbs, with lamb and new potatoes and asparagus so green it hurt to look at. In summer, she made stone fruit tarts and gazpacho and grilled fish with lemon. In autumn, she made roasted squash and braised meats and apple cider that tasted like nostalgia. And in winter, she made rich stews and dark chocolate and cinnamon rolls that filled the castle with warmth. And Lucian tasted all of it through her blood, and he fell more in love with her with each feeding. They traveled during the day, while he slept. Helena went to Paris and Tokyo and Copenhagen, eating at famous restaurants, learning new techniques, collecting memories. And at night, she would tell him about everything she'd tasted, and he would listen like she was describing miracles. The year passed faster than she wanted it to, but when the anniversary came, she was ready. They held a feast. Not just the court, but everyone who mattered to Helena Tessa and the other chefs who'd stood up for her, Patricia the lawyer, the kitchen suppliers, the food critics. Humans and vampires gathered in the great hall, watching as Helena cooked her last meal as a mortal. She made everything, every dish that had ever meant something to her. And when it was ready, she sat at the head of the table, with Lucian beside her, and she ate. She tasted slowly, deliberately, making each bite last. The salt of ham, the sweetness of honey, the bright acid of tomatoes, the richness of butter, the heat of chili, the comfort of bread. She ate until she was full, until she'd tasted every flavor she could remember wanting, and then she set down her fork and looked at Lucian. "I'm ready," she said. They left the hall together, going to his chambers, and he sat her down on the edge of the bed. "This will hurt," he warned, "more than the feedings. I'll need to drain you almost completely, and then you'll drink from me, and then you'll sleep for 3 days while your body transforms. When you wake, you'll be different, stronger, faster, immortal." But you will never taste food again. I know. She touched his face. I'm not afraid. I am. His voice was raw. I'm terrified that you'll regret this, that you'll wake up hating me for taking your mortality. I won't, because I'm not losing anything, Lucian. I'm gaining forever with you. That's worth any price. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and when he pulled away, there were tears on his face, tears tinged with red. I love you, he said. I will love you until the sun burns out and the stars go dark. I love you too. Now turn me. He bit her wrist first, then her throat, and the pain was sharp and bright and all-consuming. She felt herself draining, felt her heartbeat slowing, felt the world going dim. And just when she thought she couldn't take any more, he tore open his own wrist and pressed it to her mouth. Drink, he commanded. She did. The blood was cold and sweet and electric, and it burned through her like lightning. She drank and drank until he pulled away, and then the world went black. She dreamed of food, of every meal she'd ever cooked, every flavor she'd ever tasted. She dreamed of her grandmother's kitchen and the castle's kitchen and 1,000 kitchens she'd never seen. She dreamed of feeding people, of the joy on their faces when they tasted something extraordinary. And when she woke, Lucian was beside her. How do you feel? He asked. She took inventory. Her body felt different, stronger, lighter, more alive than it had ever been. Her senses were sharper. She could hear the blood pumping through Lucian's veins, could smell the stone of the castle walls, could see in perfect clarity despite the darkness of the room. I feel incredible, she said, and hungry. He smiled, showing Fang. That's normal. Come, let me show you your new world. He taught her how to hunt, how to feed without killing, how to control the hunger that came with being vampire. It was harder than she'd expected, but she learned. And when she'd mastered the basics, she returned to the kitchen. Cooking as a vampire was strange. She could smell everything with perfect clarity, could tell when onions were caramelized by scent alone, could judge the doneness of meat without cutting into it. But she couldn't taste. She prepared a simple pasta, the kind her grandmother had made, and served it to Celine. Perfect, Celine said. Just the right amount of garlic. Helena had to take her word for it. But she adapted. She learned to cook by memory and instinct, by trusting her technique. And she trained other chefs, mortals who would eat and taste and give her feedback, who would help her refine dishes until they were exactly right. The Table of Remembrance continued, but now Helena was on both sides of it. She cooked, and then she sat with the court, remembering what it had been to be human, to need food, to taste. And once a week, she and Lucian would find a mortal who was willing to be fed from someone who'd eaten recently, whose blood still carried the ghost of their meal. It wasn't the same as feeding from Helena when she'd cooked, but it was close. And sometimes, when Lucian tasted something particularly good, he would look at her with wonder and say, "You would have loved this." Years passed. Decades. Helena stopped counting after a while, stopped measuring time in human increments. She became known throughout the vampire world as the chef who'd sacrificed taste for love, as the mortal who'd become immortal to keep cooking for eternity. She trained hundreds of chefs. She wrote cookbooks, not recipes, but philosophy, the theory of cooking, the art of creating food that nourished more than bodies. She traveled the world, learning techniques from other cultures, other times, bringing them back to the castle kitchen. And through it all, Lucian was beside her, supporting her, loving her, reminding her why she'd chosen this life. They had centuries together. They watched the world change, new technologies, new ingredients, new ways of thinking about food. They survived wars and plagues and political upheavals. They built a life that was strange and beautiful and utterly their own. On their 100th anniversary, Lucian took her back to the balcony where he'd first told her about the Table of Remembrance. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Giving up mortality?" Helena thought about her answer. She thought about all the meals she'd never taste, all the sunrises she'd never see. She thought about the life she might have had if she'd stayed human, a normal career, maybe a family, growing old and dying in the natural order of things. And then she looked at Lucian, at the man who'd defended her when no one else would, who'd believed in her talent when she'd stopped believing in herself, who'd loved her with a constancy that only immortals could manage. "No," she said, "I don't regret a single moment. Even though you can't taste your own cooking, I taste it through the people I feed. Through you, when you drink from someone who's eaten my food, through the look on a mortal's face when they try something I've made. That's enough. More than enough." She took his hand. "You were right that first night. Food is memory, and I carry every meal I ever tasted as a mortal with me. I'll carry them for eternity. That's a gift, not a loss." He kissed her forehead. "You are extraordinary." "We're extraordinary," she corrected. "Together." And they were. A vampire king and a chef who'd given up taste for love, who'd built an empire of memory and sensation, who'd proven that some things were worth sacrificing mortality for. They stood on the balcony, watching the city lights, and Helena thought about Marcus, wondered if he was still alive, if he'd ever achieved the success he'd stolen from her. It didn't matter. He was a footnote in her story, a catalyst that had led her here, to this life, to this love. "What are you thinking about?" Lucian asked. "About how lucky I am," she said. "I get to do what I love for eternity. I get to spend forever with you. I was nothing without Marcus," he used to say. "But the truth is, I was always something. I just needed someone to remind me." "You needed to remind yourself," Lucian said. "I simply provided the opportunity. You did more than that. You saw me, really saw me. Not the person Marcus tried to make me, but the person I actually was." She turned to face him fully. "You gave me back myself, and then you gave me forever to become even more." "I love you," he said. And even after a century, the words still carried the weight of truth. "I love you too. Today, tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows we have left." They went back inside, back to the castle that had become home, back to the kitchen where Helena would cook another feast, back to the court that had become family. And as Helena tied on her apron and began pulling out ingredients, she felt the satisfaction that came from doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly who she was meant to do it with. The Table of Remembrance had become more than a ritual. It had become a symbol proof that vampires could honor their humanity, that mortals could find purpose in serving immortals, that love could bridge the gap between life and death, and at the center of it all was Helena, cooking not for sustenance but for memory, not for taste but for meaning. She chopped vegetables with centuries-old knife skills. She seasoned dishes with the intuition that came from endless practice. She plated food that was beautiful and careful and full of love. The court gathered. Lucian took his place at the head of the table. And Helena served the first course, a soup made from a recipe her grandmother had taught her 150 years ago, when she'd still been human enough to remember being a child. No one ate. But everyone remembered. And when the meal was over, when the dishes were cleared and the court had dispersed, Lucian found Helena in the kitchen, cleaning up. "Another beautiful meal," he said. "Another night of memories," she agreed. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his ancient heart. "I have been alive for 700 years, he said quietly. "I have seen empires rise and fall. I have witnessed humanity at its best and worst. I have experienced more than any mortal could dream of, but the best century of my life has been the one I spent with you." Helena closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "The best century of my life has been the one I spent with you too," she said. "And we have so many more ahead of us. An eternity of them. An eternity," she agreed. And it was true. They had forever. Forever to cook and taste and remember. Forever to love and laugh and build a life that defied every expectation. Forever to prove that some choices, no matter how difficult, were absolutely right. Helena had given up her mortality, her ability to taste, her chance at a normal human life. And in return, she'd gained everything that mattered. Purpose, love, time, the chance to become more than she'd ever imagined she could be. She'd been nothing without Marcus, he'd said, but he'd been wrong. She'd always been something. She'd always been enough. She just needed to find someone who saw it, who valued it, who would stand beside her and declare to the world that she mattered. And she had found that in Lucian, the vampire king who'd answered her ex's cruelty with 4 simple words that had changed her life. She is my everything. And she was, just as he was hers. They had built a life together, brick by brick, meal by meal, moment by moment. They had created something beautiful and strange and utterly their own, and they would continue creating it for all the centuries to come. Helena Brennan, once a chef who'd lost everything, who'd been diminished and dismissed and nearly destroyed, who'd found her way to a castle beneath the city, to a vampire king who'd seen her worth, to a love that had given her back her name. And Lucian Alaric, a king who'd lived for 6 centuries in the darkness, who'd nearly forgotten what it meant to want something beyond mere existence, who'd found in a mortal chef a reason to remember, a reason to hope, a reason to believe that even immortals could fall in love. Together, they were extraordinary. Together, they were everything, and they would be forever.